Hey guys, your assignment will be somewhat easier today, so I hope y'all had a good spring break. Hope everybody is staying healthy and safe, and that you're not sick or anything. But what we're going to talk about, so we're actually going to skip uh, Unit 6, Test 1, and Unit 6, Test 2. I'm skipping Unit 6, Test 1 because it's matrices, so that's actually not in the standards. Uh, but we've done it in the past. But anyway, so and then Unit 6, Test 2, you would need like a calculator, and I know that some people don't have calculators at home, and that becomes weird. So anyway, so we're just not even going to go there, at least not right now. Uh, but so I wanted to go to Unit 6, Test 3. This is what we're doing here. And we're going to talk about geometric sequences. And then we'll also talk about series. But right now, a geometric sequence. And this is what a geometric sequence is. It's a sequence, which just means a kind of a list of numbers, where each term after the first term is found by multiplying the previous term by a fixed non-zero number called the common ratio. So that's going to be super important. So if you look at example A, we have 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Now this is a geometric sequence. Now there are other type of sequences. So that, like, for instance, the sequence 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, so on and so forth is called an arithmetic sequence because we're just adding the same number each time. But we won't be talking about that. We're going to be talking about geometric sequences, which means we're multiplying by the same number each time. So in this case, 2 is my first term, and then the question is what is my common ratio? And we use the letter R to speak of a common ratio. And the common ratio is just what are you multiplying each time to get the next term? So 2 times what gives me 4? Well, 2 times 2. And then 4 times 2 is 8. And then 8 times 2 is 16. And then 16 times 2 is 32, so on and so forth. So if I wanted the next term, I would say 32 times 2 is 64. So then that would be the next term here. And you could keep going from there. So in this case, the common ratio would be 2. And again, we use R to represent the common ratio. Whereas in example B, look, it's a little bit weird here. My common ratio is negative 1/3. And I'll explain how I got that here when we get to these examples. So 9 times negative 1/3 is actually negative 3. Negative 3 times negative 1/3 is 1. 1 times negative 1/3 is negative 1/3, and so on and so forth. All right, so in a geometric sequence, the ratio of any term to the previous term is constant, meaning it's the same number, and we call this the common ratio. Now, the way we find that is taking any term and dividing by its previous term. So, to show you what I mean by that, if I'm looking at the example A that we did here, if I choose any term, let's say 16, and I divide by its previous term. So the previous term from 16 was 8. What do I get? Well, what's 16 divided by 8? It's 2. And 2 would have to be the common ratio, which we already talked about. So if you want to find the common ratio, you can just take any term and divide by its previous term. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, it's kind of easy to tell what the common ratio is. So if I look at example 1, I know that I'm multiplying by 2 each time. So we would say, okay, well, the common ratio is just 2. Okay, and that's fine. But there are some examples that aren't quite as simple as that. One way I could have found that is chosen any term and divided by a previous term. I'm not going to do that here because we kind of already done this example. But let's look at example 2 here is what are we multiplying by each time to get the next term? Well, you may be able to figure it out because 8 times 3 is 24. Well, what's 24 times 3? Well, it's actually 72, and so on and so forth. Okay, so here the common ratio would be 3. Again, I could have gotten that by choosing any term, let's say 24, and dividing by the previous term. Sorry, there's two cats fighting outside. So I took any term and divided it by its previous term, which would always give me the common ratio. I want to find a harder example here to kind of help you understand what I mean by it's not always quite simple. Okay, so we'll do this one. Well, what would be the common ratio for example 6? Well, 10 times, 100 times what gives me 50? Well, if you can't figure that out, just choose any term, and I'm actually going to choose 25. So choose a term, and it doesn't matter which term you choose, and divide by its previous term. Well, what's the previous term of 25? It's 50. So the common ratio would be 25 divided by 50, which is 1/2. So the common ratio in this problem is a fraction, which is fine. We already saw that. So we would say R is 1/2. And again, we got that by taking some term and dividing by its previous term. And I want to see even a harder example. And we'll be going more in depth later on. Let's see. Yeah, some of these examples are a little bit tricky. And we'll also, in the homework, we'll determine if something is a geometric sequence. The way you do that is, if you're multiplying by the same thing each time, then it's geometric. Okay. So like number 2 is not geometric because 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4 is not 36. So this would not be geometric. Whereas 3 would be geometric because I'm just multiplying by 2 each time. Okay, so I'm going to go to this example here. So if I ask you what is the common ratio here, you may be thinking, well, okay, I'm not 100% sure here. It's a little bit tricky. Just take any term. So I'm going to take that term. Here I'll use red. I'll use green actually. So 9/4. Take any term and divide, I know it looks kind of weird, by its previous term. Well, the previous term to 9/4 is 3/2. Now some of you may be thinking, how do I divide 9/4 times, or divide 9/4 divided by 3/2? Well, you may remember that division is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 3/2 is 2/3, which gives me 18 over, what, 12? Which reduces to 3/2. Which makes sense because 1 times 3/2 is 3/2. If I multiply 3/2 times 3/2, I get 9/4. If I multiply that times 3/2, I get 27/8, so on and so forth. So anyway, the homework I will give you will be asking you basically recognizing if something is geometric sequence, again, which means you're multiplying by the same number each time. So are you multiplying by the same number each time? If you are, then it's geometric. And seeing if you're able to identify the common ratio. Okay, so it's not going to be too bad today. I'm not going to give you too much work, but we will go more in depth tomorrow.